Dr. Edmund Ashford believed in empirical evidence, mathematical precision, and the supremacy of rational thought. At 32, he was London's most celebrated physician, a man who dissected problems with surgical exactitude and dismissed sentiment as weakness. His heart was a mechanism, his mind a calculating engine. But on a fog-shrouded morning in 1888, when his carriage overturned on the road to Hampshire, everything he knew would shatter. She found him bleeding among the ferns, her wild auburn hair tangled with leaves, her eyes green as the forest itself. And when her hands touched his fevered brow, Edmund Ashford felt something he had never believed existed, the stirring of his very soul. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. The rain hammered against the windows of Dr. Edmund Ashford's Harley Street practice with mechanical regularity, each droplet following the predictable laws of gravity and momentum. Inside his consulting room, Edmund stood before a human skeleton suspended from a brass stand, pointing to the seventh cervical vertebra with the tip of his silver pen. "You see, Lord Pemberton, the compression here is quite evident," he explained in his characteristically measured tone, devoid of unnecessary emotion. "The pain radiating down your left arm is merely the logical consequence of prolonged poor posture. I shall prescribe a series of exercises to be performed with mathematical precision, 3 repetitions twice daily for 6 weeks. The improvement will be quantifiable." Lord Pemberton, a portly gentleman of advancing years, nodded with the relief of a man who had found certainty in an uncertain world. "You are a marvel, Dr. Ashford. While other physicians speak in mystical terms of humours and constitutional weakness, you provide answers as clear as clockwork." Edmund permitted himself the briefest suggestion of a smile. "The human body is indeed a machine, Lord Pemberton. A magnificent machine, but a machine nonetheless. Each ailment has a rational cause, each symptom a logical explanation. There is no mystery that cannot be unravelled through systematic observation and deductive reasoning." After Lord Pemberton departed, Edmund stood alone in his consulting room, surveying the orderly domain he had constructed, medical journals arranged by date and publication, instruments sterilized and organized according to frequency of use, not a single item out of place. This was how he had rebuilt himself after the chaos of his childhood, after watching his father squander the family fortune on emotion-driven investments and romantic notions, after seeing his mother waste away from what she called a broken heart, but what Edmund knew to be nothing more than untreated melancholia. He had been 17 when he made his vow. Never again would he allow sentiment to cloud judgment. Logic would be his compass, reason his religion. His manservant Peters entered carrying the afternoon post on a silver tray. "A telegram, sir, marked urgent." Edmund opened it with his letter knife, reading the words with clinical detachment. "Edmund, your presence required Hampshire immediately. Uncle Cornelius gravely ill. Manor in disarray. Come at once. Your duty, Aunt Theodora." He had not seen his uncle's estate in 15 years, not since he had left for medical school, determined to escape the suffocating countryside with its irrational adherence to tradition and superstition. But duty, unlike emotion, was logical. His uncle had funded his education, therefore he was obligated to respond to this summons. "Peters, prepare my travelling case. I depart for Hampshire on tomorrow's first train." "Very good, sir. Will you be wanting your formal attire? I understand Ashford Manor still maintains the old customs." Edmund's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Pack what is practical, Peters. I am going as a physician, not as a performer in some antiquated social theatre." That evening, Edmund sat in his study, reviewing his uncle's medical history from the sparse letters he had received over the years. Cornelius Ashford was 73, suffering from what the local country doctor had termed a weakness of the constitution. Edmund's lip curled at the imprecision. There was no such diagnosis in any proper medical text. His gaze drifted to the window, where London sprawled beneath a blanket of coal smoke and gaslight. Here was civilization, progress, the triumph of human intellect over primitive chaos. Out there, beyond the city's edge, lay the wild places, the forests and moors, where reason held less sway, and people still whispered of omens and portents. He had built his life as a fortress against such irrationality. The journey to Hampshire began under leaden skies, the train churning through the industrial landscape before gradually giving way to rolling countryside. Edmund sat in first class, reading the latest issue of The Lancet, annotating an article on nerve pathology with his fountain pen. Across from him, an elderly woman attempted conversation. "Beautiful countryside, is it not, sir? One feels closer to God among the trees and fields." Edmund glanced up briefly. "One feels closer to atmospheric moisture and agricultural cultivation, madam. The sensation you describe is merely a neurological response to decreased urban stimulation." The woman's face registered shock, then offense, and she returned to her knitting in silence. Edmund felt no remorse. Truth required no apology. At Winchester Station, he hired a private carriage for the final leg to Ashford Manor. The driver, a weathered man with suspicious eyes, loaded Edmund's trunk with obvious reluctance. "Ashford Manor, you said, sir?" "That is correct." "Begging your pardon, sir, but you'll be wanting to arrive before nightfall. The roads through Thornwood Forest can be treacherous after dark." Edmund settled into his seat with a dismissive wave. "I am not concerned with superstitious nonsense about dangerous woods, my good man. Proceed at a reasonable pace." "It's not superstition, sir," the driver muttered as he climbed to his perch. "It's the lady." "What lady?" But the driver had already urged the horses forward, and his words were lost to the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. The countryside grew wilder as they travelled, civilization's geometric fields giving way to ancient hedgerows and tangled woodlands. The sky darkened prematurely, thick clouds smothering the afternoon sun. Edmund noted the change with scientific interest. A weather front approaching from the west, likely to produce significant precipitation within the hour. They entered Thornwood Forest as the first drops began to fall. The road narrowed to little more than a rutted track, hemmed in by towering oaks and elms, whose branches interlaced overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. Edmund found the metaphor distasteful. This was merely a biological phenomenon, trees competing for sunlight, their growth patterns determined by phototropism and resource availability. Yet something about the forest's density, its green twilight gloom, stirred an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. He dismissed it as mild claustrophobia, a rational response to confined spaces. The rain intensified, transforming from a gentle patter to a violent deluge. The driver shouted something unintelligible. The horses whinnied in alarm. Then the world tilted violently. Edmund felt himself thrown sideways as the carriage lurched, heard the sickening crack of wood splintering, experienced a moment of weightlessness before impact drove the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded across his left temple. The carriage had overturned, and he was trapped beneath shattered panels and torn leather. He tried to move, to assess his injuries with professional objectivity, but consciousness was slipping away like water through cupped hands. His last coherent thought was a calculation. Given the angle of the sun when they entered the forest and his estimated time of unconsciousness, it must now be approximately. Then darkness claimed him, and for the first time in his adult life, Dr. Edmund Ashford, master of logic and reason, surrendered to something he could not control. Edmund's return to consciousness was gradual, a slow surfacing from profound depths. His first awareness was of warmth, gentle heat radiating across his chest and face, accompanied by the sweet scent of burning applewood. His second awareness was of pain, a throbbing ache in his left temple, sharp protests from his ribs when he attempted to draw breath. His third awareness was of her. "You are waking. Good. I was beginning to wonder if your skull was thicker than it appeared." The voice was feminine but uncultivated, carrying none of the refined accents of London society. Edmund's eyes struggled to focus. He lay on a rough wooden bed covered with furs and woolen blankets. Above him, a ceiling of thatched reeds. Nearby, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, and beside the bed, holding a clay bowl that steamed with herbal-scented vapor, sat a woman unlike any he had ever encountered. She was perhaps 25, with a wild abundance of auburn hair that tumbled past her shoulders in untamed waves, threaded through with small twigs and what appeared to be dried flowers. Her face was heart-shaped, with high cheekbones and a generous mouth, but it was her eyes that arrested him, an extraordinary shade of green, like sunlight through spring leaves, bright with intelligence and something else he could not immediately classify. She wore a dress of rough, homespun linen, dyed forest green and brown, with a leather bodice laced with strips of deer hide. No corset, no proper undergarments that he could discern. Her feet were bare, though the cottage floor was earthen and surely cold. "Who are you?" Edmund attempted to sit up, but pain and dizziness forced him back down. "Someone who found you bleeding in the ferns after your carriage decided it preferred lying on its side to rolling on its wheels." She dipped a cloth into the steaming bowl and approached him. "I am going to clean your wound. Try not to be dramatic about it." Edmund's physician instincts overcame his disorientation. "I must assess the extent of my injuries. Where is my medical bag? I need proper instruments, clean bandages, antiseptic solution. You need to be still and let me work." Her hands were surprisingly gentle as she pressed the warm cloth to his temple. "You have a cut here that required stitching, which I have done. 2 cracked ribs on your left side, which I have bound. Various contusions and abrasions, none serious. You will live, though I suspect your pride has suffered the worst injury." Edmund stared at her with mounting alarm. "You stitched my wound? With what training? What sterilization procedures did you follow? The risk of infection is minimal because I know what I am doing." She rinsed the cloth and continued her work with calm efficiency. "I have been tending injuries in this forest for 10 years. Woodsmen who fell from trees, children who tumbled into streams, poachers caught in their own traps. I learned from my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before her. We have kept people alive in these woods since before your fancy London hospitals existed." "Folk medicine is not medicine at all," Edmund protested, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "It is superstition and guesswork, dressed in ritual." Her green eyes flashed with amusement. "Says the man whose life I just saved using those very superstitions." She set the cloth aside and studied him with unsettling directness. "You are Dr. Edmund Ashford, I presume. The carriage bore the Ashford crest, and you have the look of old Cornelius about the eyes. How do you know my uncle?" "Everyone in these parts knows the Lord of Ashford Manor, even those of us who live in the wild places." She moved to a rough-hewn table where various bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. "Your driver was unharmed, by the way. His horses bolted, and he went after them. I expect he will report the accident and return with help, though in this storm it may be morning before they can navigate the flooded roads." Edmund absorbed this information, his analytical mind struggling to function through the fog of pain and confusion. He was trapped in a primitive cottage with a woman who claimed medical knowledge but possessed no credentials, no formal training, no understanding of modern scientific principles. "Where exactly are we?" "My home, deep in Thornwood Forest, where the old roads give way to deer paths." She brought him a cup carved from wood, filled with a dark, aromatic liquid. "Drink this. It will ease your pain and help you sleep." Edmund recoiled. "I will not consume an unidentified substance prepared by an unknown individual with no medical oversight. Then you will lie awake all night in agony, which seems a foolish choice, even for a man of logic and reason." She set the cup on the small table beside the bed. "It is willow bark tea with honey, feverfew, and a touch of valerian root. Nothing more mysterious than what your own pharmacists synthesize in their laboratories, only fresher and more effective. She was correct about the pain. It was intensifying now that the initial shock was wearing off. Edmund's training told him that willow bark did indeed contain salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin preparations. The other ingredients were known sedatives and anti-inflammatories. "How do I know you have not poisoned it?" she laughed, a sound like water over stones. "If I wanted you dead, Dr. Ashford, I would have left you bleeding by the roadside for the foxes to find. Drink or do not drink. Your stubborn rationality is no concern of mine." Edmund watched as she moved about the cottage, adding wood to the fire, checking the bolt on the door against the storm, hanging his mud-stained coat and waistcoat to dry. Her movements were fluid, economical, completely lacking the artificial constraint of proper feminine deportment. Against his better judgment, he found himself fascinated. "You have not told me your name." She glanced at him over her shoulder, and for a moment, something playful danced in those extraordinary eyes. "I am called many things in these woods. The hermit, the wise woman, the witch of Thornwood, but my given name is Rowena. Rowena Blackwood." "Blackwood," Edmund repeated. "I know that name. There was a Blackwood family on my uncle's estate, but they were dismissed and disgraced 15 years ago, when my father was accused of poaching on manor lands." Rowena's voice remained level, but Edmund detected a current of old anger beneath the surface. "We lost our cottage, our livelihood. My parents died within 2 years. My father from a prison fever, my mother from what you would probably call simple despair. I came here, to the deepest part of the forest where no one would trouble me, and I learned to survive on my own terms." Edmund felt an unexpected stirring of something that might have been guilt, though he quickly suppressed it. "I was not present for those events. I was at Cambridge." "No, you were not present. None of the Ashfords were present when it mattered." She turned away, busying herself with arranging dried plants. "But you are here now, and you are injured, and despite our unfortunate history, I am not so petty as to withhold help from someone who needs it." Edmund studied her with the same intensity he brought to examining a particularly puzzling case. Rowena Blackwood defied every category his ordered mind tried to place her in. She was educated enough to speak clearly, yet lived like a primitive. She possessed medical knowledge that seemed effective, yet rejected formal training. She had every reason to resent him, yet had saved his life. She was, he realized with considerable irritation, a walking contradiction to his entire worldview. The pain in his ribs sharpened, and Edmund found his hand reaching for the wooden cup despite his reservations. The tea was bitter but palatable, the honey softening its harsh edges. Warmth spread through his chest, and with it a gradual easing of the throbbing in his head. "You live here alone?" he asked, his tongue already growing heavy with approaching sleep. "A woman? Unprotected? In the wilderness?" Rowena's laugh was soft, but not unkind. "I am more protected here than any lady in her manor house, Dr. Ashford. The forest is my ally, not my enemy. I know every path, every stream, every creature that walks beneath these trees. And I am certainly safer than I would be among civilized people with their refined cruelties and their elaborate systems of betrayal." Edmund wanted to argue, to explain that civilization represented humanity's triumph over chaotic nature, that order and reason were superior to instinct and impulse, but the Valerian root was working its sedative magic, and his eyelids were growing impossibly heavy. His last sight before sleep claimed him was Rowena sitting by the fire, its golden light turning her wild hair to flame, her green eyes reflecting something ancient and untamed that his logical mind could find no words to describe. Edmund woke to birdsong and pale morning light filtering through gaps in the thatched roof. For a disorienting moment he forgot where he was, expecting to see the familiar ceiling of his Harley Street bedroom. Then memory returned. The overturned carriage, the forest, the woman with eyes like spring leaves. He attempted to sit up and was pleased to discover the movement caused considerably less pain than the previous evening. His ribs still protested, but the sharp, breath-stealing agony had diminished to a manageable ache. He touched his temple gingerly, finding neat stitches beneath a clean bandage. Rowena entered carrying an earthenware pitcher and a basket of what appeared to be freshly gathered plants. She wore the same rough dress, but her hair had been partially braided, the practical arrangement doing nothing to tame its fundamental wildness. "You are awake. Excellent. I was beginning to wonder if I had been too generous with the valerian." She set the pitcher and basket on the table and approached the bed. "Let me examine your pupils. If they are uneven, you may have bleeding inside your skull, in which case you will need more care than I can provide here." Edmund submitted to the examination with poor grace. "I am perfectly capable of assessing my own condition." "Then assess away, doctor. But permit me to verify your conclusions. Your judgment was somewhat impaired when you decided to travel through Thornwood during a storm." She leaned close, studying his eyes with professional concentration. Edmund found himself acutely aware of her proximity, the scent of herbs and wood smoke that clung to her skin, the complete absence of the rosewater and lavender that civilized women daubed on their pulse points. "Equal dilation, good responsiveness," she murmured. "No signs of intracranial pressure. You were fortunate." "I was careless," Edmund corrected, irritated by his own lapse in judgment. "I should have anticipated the road conditions and delayed my journey." There speaks the voice of cold logic." Rowena moved away to pour water from the pitcher into 2 wooden cups. "Does it never tire you, this constant calculation of variables and probabilities? Does your mechanical heart never long for something that cannot be reduced to numbers?" "The heart is a pump," Edmund replied automatically. 4 chambers, 2 atria, 2 ventricles, functioning to circulate blood through approximately 60,000 miles of vessels in the human body. It does not long for anything. Such anthropomorphization is sentimental nonsense." Rowena handed him a cup of water and settled into a chair carved from a single piece of oak, its arms smoothed by years of use. "Tell me, Dr. Ashford, when did you become so terrified of feeling?" The question struck him like a physical blow. "I am not terrified, I am rational. Rationality and fear are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I suspect your precious logic is merely a fortress you have constructed against the possibility of being hurt." She sipped her water, watching him over the rim. "What happened to you that made you this way?" Edmund's first instinct was to refuse the personal inquiry, to maintain the professional distance he kept between himself and all other human beings. But something about this primitive cottage, this wild woman, this removal from his carefully ordered life, loosened the constraints he normally imposed on himself. "My father," he heard himself say, "was ruled entirely by emotion. Love, passion, enthusiasm, despair. He followed every impulse, trusted every feeling. He invested in ventures that sparked his imagination rather than his intellect. He fell violently in love with my mother and promised her the moon and stars. When his romantic schemes failed, as they inevitably did, she wasted away from what she called heartbreak. And you concluded that feeling leads only to destruction. I concluded that emotion without reason is dangerous. My father died penniless, my mother died needlessly, and I was left to rebuild everything they had squandered. Logic saved me. Discipline saved me. I have no intention of apologizing for that." Rowena was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying him with what might have been pity or understanding. "And yet here you sit, alive because I use knowledge passed down through feeling and instinct, through connection to the living world that your science dismisses as primitive ignorance. Folk knowledge occasionally stumbles upon effective remedies," Edmund conceded. "But that does not validate the superstitious worldview underlying it." "Does it not?" Rowena rose and retrieved her basket, bringing it to the bedside. "Look at these plants, Doctor. Tell me what you see." Edmund examined the contents with professional interest despite himself. Foxglove, comfrey, St. John's wort, yarrow, various medicinal herbs. And how did I know where to find each one? Not by memorizing tables in medical texts, but by watching the forest, by understanding the rhythms of growth and decay, by sensing what the land itself was telling me. She ran her fingers gently over the leaves. This foxglove grows only where the soil is acidic and the shade is deep. This particular plant contains enough digitalis to strengthen a failing heart or stop a healthy one, depending on dosage. I know this not from measurement, but from relationship, from connection. Anthropomorphization again, Edmund insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. You are attributing intention and communication to organisms that merely respond to environmental stimuli. Am I? Rowena's smile was enigmatic. Or are you so committed to your mechanical universe that you cannot perceive the deeper patterns your instruments are too crude to measure? Edmund had no answer to that. His head was beginning to ache again, though whether from his injury or from the fundamental challenge this woman posed to his worldview, he could not determine. I need to send word to my uncle's estate, he said, retreating to practical concerns. My aunt will be anxious, and my uncle requires my medical attention. A search party will find us by midday, Rowena assured him. The storm has passed, and the foresters know these woods well. In the meantime, you should eat something. I have porridge with honey and blackberries, if your refined palate can tolerate such simple fare. The porridge was, Edmund was forced to admit, excellent. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the calls of birds in the trees outside. Edmund found himself oddly reluctant to see the rescue party arrive, though he would never have admitted this even to himself. What will you do, he asked eventually, when your herbs and forest wisdom inevitably fail? When you encounter an injury or illness beyond your limited capabilities? Rowena met his gaze with perfect calm. I will do what I always do, my best, with the knowledge I possess and the resources available. I do not pretend to omniscience, Dr. Ashford. Unlike you, I am comfortable admitting the boundaries of my understanding. I admit limitations constantly. That is the foundation of scientific inquiry. No, you admit the limitations of current knowledge while maintaining absolute faith that eventually your science will explain everything. You cannot tolerate mystery. You cannot accept that some things may forever elude your measuring instruments and your chemical analyses. Before Edmund could formulate a response, voices called out in the distance. Rowena rose and opened the cottage door. Through the frame, Edmund could see sunlight slanting through the trees, the storm-cleansed forest glittering with moisture. 3 men emerged from the undergrowth, foresters by their dress carrying axes and coils of rope. Miss Rowena, the eldest called. We heard about the accident. Is the gentleman alive and recovering? Rowena assured them. Though he will need careful transport to Ashford Manor, his ribs are cracked. The men entered the cottage, their expressions mixing respect and something that looked like superstitious awe when they glanced at Rowena. They fashioned a litter from branches and blankets with practiced efficiency, and soon Edmund found himself being carried through the forest like precious cargo. As they departed, he looked back at Rowena, standing in her cottage doorway, a solitary figure framed by dark timber and dappled sunlight. She raised one hand in farewell, and Edmund felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with cracked ribs. "The witch saved your life, sir," one of the foresters remarked as they navigated a narrow path. "You are fortunate. She does not help everyone who stumbles into her domain." "She is not a witch," Edmund said sharply. "She is merely a woman with some medical knowledge and an unfortunate tendency toward mystical thinking." The foresters exchanged glances but said nothing more. They emerged from Thornwood Forest an hour later, and Edmund caught his first glimpse of Ashford Manor rising against the Hampshire hills, a sprawling Jacobean edifice of honey-coloured stone, its mullioned windows catching the afternoon sun. He should have felt relief at returning to civilization, to the world of reason and order. Instead, he felt only an odd sense of loss, as if he had left something essential behind in that primitive cottage, in the presence of a wild woman with impossible green eyes who had, against all logic, begun to haunt his carefully guarded thoughts. Ashford Manor's great hall was precisely as Edmund remembered, soaring hammer-beam ceiling, walls lined with ancestral portraits, the pervasive scent of beeswax and old wood. His Aunt Theodora descended the main staircase like a ship in full sail, her black bombazine dress rustling with authority. "Edmund, we received word of your accident. How badly are you injured? Should I summon Dr. Pemberton from the village?" "That will not be necessary, Aunt. My injuries are minor and have been competently addressed." Edmund permitted her to embrace him, though physical affection still made him uncomfortable. "How is Uncle Cornelius?" Theodora's imperious expression crumbled into genuine worry. "Failing, I fear. He has not left his bed in 3 weeks. Dr. Pemberton says it is his heart, but the prescribed treatments seem to accomplish nothing." Edmund followed her up the carved oak staircase, his ribs protesting each step. They passed through corridors lined with mahogany paneling and silk wallpaper, the accumulated wealth of generations. It all seemed suffocating after the Spartan simplicity of Rowena's cottage, though Edmund immediately suppressed this disloyal thought. Cornelius Ashford lay propped on pillows in a 4-poster bed, large enough to accommodate a family. He had aged dramatically since Edmund last saw him, flesh melted from his bones, skin grey as old paper, eyes sunken but still sharp with intelligence. "Edmund, my boy." His voice was reedy but warm. "You came. Theodora said you would, but I feared London had made you too grand for your country relatives." "Never, Uncle." Edmund approached the bed, his physician's mind already cataloguing symptoms. "Tell me how you are feeling. Describe your symptoms with as much detail as possible." Over the next hour, Edmund conducted a thorough examination. Irregular heartbeat, labored breathing, swollen ankles indicating fluid retention, classic signs of congestive heart failure, as he had suspected. He reviewed Dr. Pemberton's treatment plan: bed rest, digitalis tincture, dietary restrictions. "The treatment protocol is sound," Edmund reported to his aunt afterward in the drawing room. "There is little more to be done medically. At his age, with this degree of cardiac compromise, we can only make him comfortable." Theodora's fingers twisted her handkerchief. "Surely there must be something. You are the finest physician in London. Everyone says so." "I am skilled, Aunt, but I'm not a miracle worker. The human heart has limitations, and Uncle's heart has reached them. Then he will die." It was not a question. "Eventually, yes. Perhaps weeks, perhaps months. The progression is impossible to predict with certainty." Theodora rose and walked to the window overlooking the formal gardens. "He was so vital once, so commanding. To see him reduced to this. Emotion will not alter the medical reality," Edmund said, though not unkindly. "We must face facts with clear eyes." His aunt turned, and her expression was peculiar. "You are very like your father, Edmund, despite your efforts to be his opposite." "I am nothing like my father." "Oh, but you are. He threw himself wholly into feeling. You throw yourself wholly into thinking. But both of you are equally unbalanced. Both of you are running from something you will not name." Edmund had no answer to this. He retired to his assigned room, grateful for the solitude, and found his medical bag had been retrieved from the carriage wreckage. He spent the evening organizing his instruments and making detailed notes on his uncle's condition, seeking refuge in the familiar rituals of his profession. But his mind kept drifting to Thornwood Forest, to a cottage that smelled of herbs and wood smoke, to a woman who moved through the world with the confidence of someone who understood mysteries his science could not measure. Over the following days, Edmund fell into a routine. Mornings were spent attending to his uncle, monitoring his deterioration with clinical precision. Afternoons were devoted to correspondence with his London colleagues and reading medical journals in the Manor's extensive library. Evenings involved formal dinners with his aunt and occasional visitors from neighbouring estates. It was during one such dinner that he first heard Rowena's name spoken in society. Lady Margaret Hartwell, a widow of substantial fortune and even more substantial opinions, held forth on the topic of local scandals. I heard the most disturbing report from my gamekeeper. Apparently, the Blackwood girl is still living wild in Thornwood Forest, practicing her heathen medicine on anyone foolish enough to seek her out. Blackwood? Edmund's attention sharpened. What do you know of her? Only that she is a disgrace to decent society, Lady Margaret declared. Her father was a poacher and a drunkard. When he was rightfully imprisoned, the girl disappeared into the forest, rather than seeking honest employment. Now she lives like an animal, corrupting the morals of any who venture near her cottage. Edmund felt an unfamiliar heat rising in his chest. I encountered Miss Blackwood recently. She provided competent medical care under difficult circumstances. I found nothing disgraceful in her conduct. The table fell silent. Lady Margaret's eyes widened. You went to her cottage? My carriage overturned in the storm. She rendered assistance. Her treatment was effective. No, Edmund, Aunt Theodora intervened gently. You must understand. The Blackwood family brought scandal upon themselves. The girl's choice to live in isolation, refusing proper Christian society, only confirms her unsuitability. Unsuitable for what? Edmund demanded. For the privilege of serving in houses like this one? For enduring the judgment of those who condemned her father without adequate evidence? There was abundant evidence, Lady Margaret insisted. Lord Ashford himself oversaw the investigation. Edmund looked to his aunt, who had the grace to appear uncomfortable. Your uncle did what he thought necessary to protect his property rights. These decisions are never simple. On the contrary, Edmund said coldly, they seem to have been quite simple indeed. A poor family accused, convicted in absentia, their lives destroyed so that property boundaries might remain inviolate. He excused himself from dinner immediately afterward, ignoring his aunt's protests. In his room, he paced like a caged animal, his ordered mind in uncharacteristic turmoil. The Blackwood case had occurred during his absence at university. He had never questioned the official version of events. Now, having met Rowena, having witnessed her competence and dignity, he found himself questioning everything. The next morning, Edmund informed his aunt he was going for a walk to aid his recovery. Before she could offer to accompany him, he set out across the manor grounds, past the formal gardens and manicured lawns, toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of Thornwood Forest. He found the path by memory and instinct, following the route the foresters had taken. The forest closed around him like a living thing, verdant and watchful. He should have felt threatened by this wilderness. Instead, he felt something closer to anticipation. Rowena's cottage appeared precisely where he remembered it, nestled in a small clearing where sunlight fell in golden shafts. Smoke rose from the chimney. Edmund knocked on the rough wooden door. She opened it wearing the same homespun dress, her hair loose and wild, her green eyes registering surprise and something else he could not quite identify. Dr. Ashford, I did not expect to see you again so soon. I came to... He stopped, realizing he had no clear explanation for his presence. I came to thank you properly for your care and to apologize. Apologize for what? For my family's treatment of yours, for the injustice done to your father, for the prejudice you have endured, for the casual cruelty of those who believe their social position grants them the right to destroy lives without consequence. Rowena studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. You had better come in then. This sounds like a conversation that requires tea. Inside, the cottage was exactly as he remembered. Only now he noticed details that had escaped him in his injured state. Bundles of dried herbs labeled in a neat, educated hand. Handmade books filled with drawings of plants and careful notes. A violin hanging on the wall, its wood polished with use. You play? He asked, gesturing to the instrument. My mother taught me. She was a lady's maid at your uncle's manor before she married my father. She could read music, speak French, arrange flowers according to the latest fashion. None of that saved her when scandal came. Rowena prepared tea with efficient movements, and they sat on opposite sides of the rough table. Edmund found himself studying her with the same intensity he brought to examining a complex medical case, trying to understand how someone with her obvious intelligence and capability had been so thoroughly dismissed by his class. "You said you were apologizing," Rowena prompted. "I am waiting to hear the substance of this apology. My family wronged yours. I cannot undo what was done, but I can acknowledge it." "Acknowledgement without action is merely words, Doctor." Her tone was not hostile, merely factual. "Your uncle still owns half the county. His word is law to the villagers and foresters. If you truly wish to apologize, you could speak to him, convince him to posthumously clear my father's name. My uncle is dying. I doubt he has the strength for such concerns." "Of course, the convenience of mortality." Rowena sipped her tea. "Tell me the real reason you came here today, Edmund, and do not insult me with polite fictions." The use of his Christian name startled him. More startling was his own response, a desire to be honest, to drop the professional mask he wore like armor. "I cannot stop thinking about what you said. About feeling versus thinking, about mysteries that elude measurement. You challenged everything I have built my life upon, and I find myself unsettled." "Good. Unsettled is the beginning of wisdom. I am a man of science. Uncertainty is antithetical to my purpose." Rowena leaned forward, her eyes intense. "No, Edmund, certainty is the death of science. True inquiry requires the courage to admit what you do not know, to remain open to possibilities that contradict your theories. You have confused science with dogma." Edmund opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. She was, he realized with considerable discomfort, correct. He had indeed constructed a worldview as rigid as any religious doctrine, demanding faith in materialism as absolute as any believer's faith in the divine. "If I accept your premise," he said carefully, "what then? Do I abandon reason altogether, embrace superstition, and call it enlightenment? False dichotomy. I'm not asking you to abandon reason, only to expand it, to recognize that feeling and intuition are also forms of knowing, equally valid in their own domains." She reached across the table, and before he could react, placed her hand over his. "Tell me what you feel right now, in this moment. Not what you think, what you feel." Edmund stared at their joined hands. Her fingers were rough from outdoor work, warm from the teacup, utterly real and present. He felt. What did he feel? Confusion, he admitted. Attraction. Fear. An urge to flee and an equal urge to stay. A sense that my life is balanced on a knife's edge, and the next thing I say or do will tip me irrevocably in one direction or another. Rowena smiled, and it transformed her face from merely striking to genuinely beautiful. "There. Was that so difficult? You have just described the human condition far more accurately than any medical text ever could. I do not know what to do with these feelings. You do not have to do anything with them. Simply allow them to exist. Stop trying to solve every problem, classify every sensation, reduce every mystery to a formula." She squeezed his hand gently, then released it. "The forest taught me this. Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced." They talked for hours, the afternoon sun tracking across the cottage floor. Edmund found himself describing his childhood, his father's failures, his mother's decline, the vow he had made to never be vulnerable in that way. Rowena listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that pierced straight to the heart of matters he had never articulated even to himself. In return, she spoke of her own losses, her years of solitude, the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving in the wild places. She showed him her books of botanical drawings, her careful notations on the properties of various plants. The work was rigorous, systematic, every bit as disciplined as his own medical studies, only grounded in direct observation rather than academic authority. "You are a scientist," he said with genuine surprise. "You simply practice your science differently than I do." Perhaps we are not so different as you believed. When Edmund finally rose to leave, the sun was setting, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. At the cottage door, he turned back to face her. "May I return? To continue our conversation?" Rowena's smile was knowing. "The forest is open to those who approach with respect, Dr. Ashford. You will always be welcome here." As Edmund walked back through Thornwood, the evening birds singing their last songs of the day, he felt something cracking inside his chest. Not his healing ribs, but something deeper, some carefully constructed wall he had been maintaining for 15 years. He had come to Hampshire to fulfill a duty to his dying uncle. He had not expected to encounter a wild woman who would make him question everything he thought he knew about life, about science, about himself. And he had absolutely no idea what to do about any of it. Edmund returned to Rowena's cottage the next day, and the day after, and every day for the following 2 weeks. He told himself he was conducting a study of folk medicine, gathering data on traditional remedies for potential academic publication. His rational mind needed this justification, this scientific framework, for what was rapidly becoming something his reason could not explain. Rowena, to her credit, never challenged this fiction directly. She simply welcomed him each time he arrived, sharing her knowledge with the same generous spirit she brought to all her interactions with the natural world. She taught him to identify plants by more than their taxonomic features. "Yes, Edmund, that is Hypericum perforatum, St. John's wort. But look deeper. See how it grows in clearings where light is abundant. See how the flowers always face the sun. This is a plant of joy, of brightness, dispelling darkness. Its medicine treats melancholy not just because of its chemical constituents, but because it carries within it the essence of sunlight itself. That is poetic metaphor, not medical science." "Is it? Then why does your science confirm its effectiveness for treating depression?" "Perhaps your instruments are simply measuring what I perceive directly. That this plant contains light, literally captures photons and transforms them into molecules that lift the human spirit." Edmund had no answer to this. The boundaries between science and poetry, between measurement and meaning, were becoming increasingly blurred in Rowena's presence. She took him deep into Thornwood, to places no gamekeeper or forester ever ventured. They found ancient oaks that predated the Norman conquest, their massive trunks hollow with age, but still producing leaves each spring. They discovered streams where wild watercress grew in such abundance that the water seemed to flow green. They watched a fox teaching her cubs to hunt, the young ones tumbling over each other in mock battle while their mother kept patient vigil. "This is the world that exists beyond your hospitals and laboratories," Rowena said, as they sat on a fallen log, watching evening descend over the forest. "This is the system your science claims to understand, but barely touches. Every creature here is connected to every other, part of a vast web of relationships that cannot be reduced to individual components. The forest itself is alive, Edmund, not metaphorically. Actually alive in ways your colleagues refuse to acknowledge." Edmund wanted to argue, to cite the distinction between individual organisms and ecosystems, between consciousness and mere biological processes. But watching the interplay of life around him, the insects pollinating flowers, the birds feeding on insects, the trees providing shelter for birds, the fallen trees nourishing new growth, he could not deny the systemic intelligence of the whole. "You are dangerous," he said, only half joking. "You undermine the foundations of rational thought." "I undermine the foundations of your particular rationality. There are other ways of thinking, Edmund, other modes of understanding. Your science is powerful, but it is not the only path to truth." At the manor, life continued its stately progression toward death. Uncle Cornelius weakened daily, his heart laboring ever more irregularly. Edmund monitored him with professional detachment, adjusted his medications, kept meticulous records. But increasingly he found his thoughts straying to the forest, to Rowena, to possibilities he had spent his adult life denying. Aunt Theodora noticed the change. "You seem different, Edmund. Distracted." Are you unwell? Should you return to London for a rest? I am perfectly well, Aunt, merely thoughtful. You are visiting that Blackwood girl. It was not a question. The servants have seen you walking toward Thornwood every morning. Edmund met her gaze steadily. I am consulting with Miss Blackwood on matters of botanical medicine. Her knowledge is extensive and potentially valuable. She is unsuitable, Edmund. Surely you understand this. Unsuitable for what? I'm not proposing marriage, merely acknowledging expertise. But even as he spoke the words, Edmund recognized them for the lie they were. Because he was, in fact, beginning to imagine precisely what he claimed he was not imagining. A life that included Rowena, that incorporated her wild wisdom into his ordered existence, that somehow bridged the impossible gap between her world and his. It was madness. It violated every principle he had lived by. And yet, as the days passed, it felt less like madness and more like the first sane thought he had entertained in 15 years. The crisis came on a moonless night 3 weeks after his arrival. A messenger pounded on the cottage door, where Edmund sat with Rowena, discussing the anti-inflammatory properties of willow bark versus modern salicylates. "Dr. Ashford, you must come at once. Lord Cornelius has taken a terrible turn. Dr. Pemberton says it is the end." Edmund ran through the darkness, his healing ribs screaming protest, arriving at the manor to find his uncle gasping for breath, his lips tinged blue from lack of oxygen. Pemberton stood by uselessly, offering platitudes about God's will and peaceful endings. Edmund pushed him aside and made a rapid assessment: acute pulmonary edema. The failing heart could no longer pump efficiently, causing fluid to accumulate in the lungs. The standard treatment was digitalis, to strengthen the heart's contraction, and diuretics, to eliminate excess fluid. But Cornelius had been on maximum doses for weeks. There was nothing left in Edmund's medical arsenal. He was watching his uncle drown in his own fluids, and all his scientific knowledge was useless. "Step aside." Rowena's voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her rough dress, her wild hair utterly out of place among the mahogany and silk of the manor house. "Miss Blackwood, this is not—" Pemberton began. "I said step aside." She approached the bed, her basket of herbs over one arm, and looked to Edmund. "Do you trust me?" It was the question he had been avoiding for weeks. The question that demanded he choose between his rational worldview and something his reason could not accommodate. In his uncle's laboured breathing, Edmund heard the ticking of a clock running down, the mechanical heart finally failing. And he realized machines could be fixed by mechanics, but humans needed something more. "Yes," he said, "I trust you." Rowena worked quickly. Brewing a tea from foxglove leaves she measured by eye rather than scale, adding hawthorn berries and what Edmund recognized as dandelion root. She elevated Cornelius's head, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice as she helped him sip the preparation. "This will strengthen your heart and help your body release the water that is drowning you. But you must fight, Lord Ashford. You must want to stay." "Nothing more to stay for," Cornelius wheezed. "Made too many mistakes, hurt too many people. Then stay long enough to make amends." Rowena's voice was firm but not unkind. "You carry guilt, and it weighs on your heart more heavily than any physical ailment. Release it. Forgive yourself. Choose to live." She placed her hands on Cornelius's chest, and Edmund watched something extraordinary happen. His uncle's breathing, which had been shallow and panicked, began to deepen and slow. Colour returned to his lips. The terrible rattling in his lungs gradually eased. Within an hour, Cornelius was sleeping peacefully, his pulse still irregular, but notably stronger. The crisis had passed. Dr. Pemberton fled the room muttering about witchcraft and devils. Aunt Theodora stared at Rowena with an expression mixing gratitude and fear. Edmund simply stood, his entire understanding of medicine, of reality itself, fundamentally shaken. "What did you do?" he asked when they were alone in the corridor. "I gave him medicine for his body and his spirit. Your science treats one, my knowledge treats both. Together they are more effective than either alone." She studied him in the lamplight. "You are angry." "I am confused." challenged, forced to reconsider principles I believed absolute. Good. That is where real learning begins. Edmund reached out and took her hand, no longer caring about propriety or professional distance. Teach me. Show me how to practice medicine that treats the whole person, not just the measurable symptoms. I do not ask you to abandon what you know, but help me expand what I know. Rowena's green eyes searched his face. You understand what you are asking. This path leads away from your London practice, your prestigious career, your position in rational society. You cannot serve two masters, Edmund. You cannot be the cold logician and the healer who acknowledges mystery. You must choose. I am choosing. The words came from someplace beyond his calculating mind, from the part of himself he had suppressed for so long. I am choosing you, your wisdom, your way of seeing. I am choosing to feel instead of merely thinking. Edmund, I am choosing to accept that I love you, even though love defies every logical principle I ever held sacred. I'm choosing to believe that the stirring in my chest when I see you is more real than any formula in any medical text. I'm choosing to let my soul be captured, even though I do not entirely believe in souls. Rowena smiled then, radiant and wild. Oh, Edmund, your soul has always existed. You simply refuse to acknowledge it. She kissed him there in the corridor, surrounded by generations of disapproving Ashford ancestors in their gilded frames, and Edmund felt something fundamental shift inside him. The fortress of reason cracked open, and what flooded in was not chaos, but a different kind of order, organic, flowing, alive. In the days that followed, Cornelius made a remarkable recovery. The crisis had broken something in him as well, some pride that had been poisoning his spirit. He summoned Edmund and Rowena to his bedside and spoke words Edmund had never expected to hear. Miss Blackwood, I wronged your family. Your father was innocent of poaching. I knew it then, but I was protecting my gamekeeper's son, who was the actual culprit. I let an innocent man go to prison to shield someone of my own class. It is a sin I have carried for 15 years. And it has been killing me more surely than any disease of the heart. And Rowena listened without expression, then nodded slowly. I accept your confession, Lord Ashford. I do not know if I can forgive, but I acknowledge your honesty. I will make what restitution I can. My solicitors will draft documents clearing your father's name, restoring your family's reputation. And this cottage in Thornwood, the one you have made your home, it is yours, legally deeded, with 10 acres of surrounding forest. It is inadequate compensation, but it is what I can offer. After they left his chamber, Edmund turned to Rowena. Are you satisfied with his offering? I am satisfied that he spoke truth. The land is generous, but what I value most is the acknowledgement. My father's name will be cleared. That matters more than any deed. That evening, Edmund sent a telegram to his London practice, extending Hampshire stay indefinitely, pursuing new research. Will advise of permanent plans soon. Because he was beginning to understand that his place was not in London, dissecting symptoms and prescribing measured treatments. His place was here, in the wild borderlands between civilization and forest, learning a medicine that honored both science and soul, both reason and mystery. His place was with Rowena, the wild lady of the woods who had captured his soul and, in doing so, had finally made him whole. 6 months later, Edmund Ashford sat in what had once been Rowena's cottage, but was now their shared home, expanded with a new room that served as both medical clinic and botanical laboratory. The space married his scientific instruments, microscope, scales, anatomical charts, with her bundles of drying herbs, botanical drawings, and hand-bound books of traditional knowledge. On the table between them lay a manuscript on the integration of folk botanical knowledge with modern medical practice, authored by Dr. Edmund Ashford and Miss Rowena Blackwood. It represented months of collaborative work, documenting traditional remedies with scientific rigor, while honoring the holistic philosophy underlying them. Do you truly believe the medical establishment will accept this? Rowena asked, reviewing the final pages. Some will dismiss it as romantic nonsense. Others will plagiarize our findings while refusing to credit the source. But a few will recognize what we have accomplished here. A bridge between two ways of knowing, each enriching the other. Edmund looked up from his notes. And honestly, I no longer care whether they accept it or not. I know it is true. We have proven it with our patients. Those patients had come slowly at first, villagers suffering ailments that conventional medicine had failed to address, desperate enough to risk consulting the Witch of Thornwood and her unlikely partner. But word had spread of their successes. The farmer's daughter, whose chronic headaches ceased after treatment, combining Edmund's neurological expertise with Rowena's herbal preparations. The blacksmith, whose infected hand Edmund would have amputated, saved instead by Rowena's poultices and his surgical debridement. The pregnant woman whose difficult labor both had attended, each contributing essential knowledge that brought mother and child safely through. They had developed a practice unlike any other in England, systematic and intuitive, scientific and spiritual, always treating the whole person rather than isolated symptoms. Uncle Cornelius had recovered enough to resume limited activities. Though Edmund monitored him carefully, the old man's character had softened with his brush with mortality. He became a vocal advocate for Edmund and Rowena's work, using his influence to shield them from the more vicious gossip that inevitably surrounded their unconventional partnership. "Marry her, you fool," Cornelius had said bluntly one afternoon. "I may be old-fashioned about many things, but I recognize genuine partnership when I see it. You need each other. That is rarer than most people realize." Edmund had needed no urging. He had proposed to Rowena one evening in the forest, offering her a ring made not of gold, but of interwoven silver birch and oak, symbolic of their joining of different worlds. "I cannot promise you London society or a conventional life," he had said. "I can only promise to spend every day learning from you, building something new with you, honoring both what I know and what you know." "Edmund," she had replied, "I never wanted conventional. I only wanted real. And you, finally, have become real." They married quietly in the village church, with Aunt Theodora and Uncle Cornelius as witnesses. Dr. Pemberton, who had initially condemned Rowena as a witch, had grudgingly admitted that her methods produced results his did not. He referred patients to them now, though he couched it in terms of experimental treatment to preserve his professional dignity. Lady Margaret Hartwell and her circle still whispered scandal, but their power had diminished in the face of undeniable success. When their own family members fell ill and conventional medicine failed, they too eventually sought out the clinic in Thornwood, though they always claimed to be consulting Dr. Ashford specifically, as if Rowena's contribution could be politely ignored. Edmund and Rowena simply smiled and continued their work. On this particular autumn evening, they sat by the fire after finishing their manuscript, comfortable in the silence that had become one of their greatest intimacies. Edmund no longer felt the need to fill every moment with rational discourse. He had learned the value of simply being present, of allowing experience to unfold without constant analysis. "Do you ever regret it?" Rowena asked suddenly. "Leaving behind your London practice, your prestigious career, everything you worked so hard to build?" Edmund considered the question with the honesty she deserved. "I regret losing nothing. I only regret that I spent so many years believing that thinking was superior to feeling, that reason was the only path to truth. You showed me that I was half alive, Edmund, operating on one cylinder of human capacity. Now I feel fully present in my own life for the first time." "You showed me something as well," Rowena admitted. "I thought I had rejected civilization entirely, that my path required complete isolation. But you demonstrated that science and soul are not enemies, that systematic thinking can coexist with intuitive knowing, that I did not have to abandon one to honor the other. They had each transformed the other, met in the middle ground between wildness and order, between forest and manor, between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge." A knock at the door interrupted their reflection. Edmund rose to find a young forester, hat in hand, expression anxious. "Begging your pardon, Doctor, Miss Rowena. My wife is laboring with our first child, and it is not going well. The midwife from the village is with her, but she sent me to fetch you both. She says the baby is turned wrong." Edmund and Rowena exchanged a glance, communicating volumes without words. Edmund gathered his medical instruments while Rowena collected her herbal preparations. Within minutes, they were following the forester through the darkening forest, moving with the confidence of those who knew these paths as well as their own heartbeats. The laboring woman's cottage was small but clean, the village midwife doing her competent best, but clearly out of her depth with the complicated presentation. Edmund examined the patient while Rowena prepared a tea to ease her pain and strengthen her contractions. "The baby is breech," Edmund confirmed. "I can attempt manual version, turning the child from outside, but it is risky. Or I can help her body do what it knows how to do," Rowena added, her hands already moving to specific points on the woman's abdomen, pressing and manipulating with practiced skill. "Women have been birthing breech babies since the beginning of time. Her body knows the way. We simply need to help it remember." They worked in seamless coordination, Edmund monitoring the baby's heartbeat, prepared to intervene surgically if necessary, Rowena guiding the laboring woman through breathing and positioning that allowed gravity and anatomy to work together. It took 3 hours, but the baby finally emerged healthy and screaming, a daughter with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. Walking back through the forest near midnight, Rowena took Edmund's hand. "Do you remember the first night we met, when you were injured and furious about being treated with folk medicine? I remember thinking you were dangerous. I was. I am. I challenge every certainty you ever possessed." "You destroyed every certainty I ever possessed," Edmund corrected, "and I am grateful for it. You taught me that the heart is not merely a pump, that the forest is not merely a collection of individual organisms, that healing is not merely the application of chemical treatments to biological malfunctions." "And what is healing, Dr. Ashford?" Edmund stopped walking, turning to face her in the dappled moonlight filtering through autumn leaves. "Healing is the restoration of wholeness. And wholeness requires acknowledging all parts of ourselves, the rational and the intuitive, the scientific and the spiritual, the civilized and the wild." Rowena smiled, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that still smelled of the herbs she had been working with. "You are no longer the man of cold logic I found bleeding among the ferns." "No, I am not. That man was imprisoned in his own reason, terrified of feeling, convinced that control was the same as strength. You freed me, Rowena. You captured my soul, but in capturing it you actually set it free." They kissed there in the forest, two people who had each been incomplete, becoming something greater together. Behind them, Thornwood whispered its ancient wisdom through rustling leaves. Ahead, their cottage glowed with welcoming firelight. Edmund had come to Hampshire to fulfill a duty, to practice medicine according to established principles, to remain safely enclosed in his fortress of rationality. Instead, he had discovered that the greatest medicine was love, the deepest science was wisdom, and the truest logic was acknowledging mystery. He had been a man of cold logic and reason, but the wild lady of the woods had captured his soul, and in losing his certainty, he had found his truth. Not the calculated truth of theorems and proofs, but the living truth of connection, of belonging to something larger than himself, of being fully human in all the messy, miraculous complexity that entailed. As they entered their cottage, Rowena turned to him one last time. "No regrets, then?" "None," Edmund said, and meant it with every fibre of his being. "I spent 32 years trying to be a perfect machine. I would much rather spend the rest of my life learning to be an imperfect human." "Then we shall learn together," Rowena replied, "and heal together, and live together in this wild, beautiful, impossible way we have created." They closed the door on the night, two souls intertwined, two ways of knowing finally integrated, two solitary hearts becoming one whole and undefended thing. In the morning, they would return to their patience, their research, their ongoing work of bridging worlds. But tonight, they simply held each other by the fire, content to exist in the perfect present moment, feeling rather than thinking, being rather than analyzing, alive in all the ways that truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Thank you for listening, and may you find your own wild wisdom wherever you journey.